What was the first animated film? A simple question with a complicated answer. After all, the answer depends on what you do or do not consider both animation and film. Visual tricks designed to give the illusion of life date back to ancient times, and eventually we had devices like the phenakistoscope and later the zoetrope. What counts as film? Does it have to be on perforated strips of celluloid? Well then, that would disqualify most contemporary movies which are digital. Personally, I like to think of film as a projection of images, viewable by a crowd, which in sequence gives the illusion of motion. And what of animation? What separates it from live action? After all, both are a series of still images that in sequence look, well, animated. I think most of us would say that, colloquially speaking, animation is simply a form of film that doesn't use live actors, whether the subjects are drawn, sculpted, computer-generated, cut out, or even painted. So, altogether, I think a solid definition of an animated film is a series of images of non-live subjects projected for a crowd that played in sequence gives the illusion of motion. Under that definition, I and many others would consider the earliest animated films to be those of Émile Reynaud, the creator of the praxinoscope and the théâtre optique, with which he made movies in the late 19th century. Not only years before animators like James Stewart Blackton and Winsor McCay, but even before the Lumière brothers, Auguste and Louis, invented the cinematograph in 1895, and thus 3 years before what was traditionally considered the birth of film. Charles-Émile Reynaud, often referred to simply as Émile Reynaud, was born on December 8, 1844. From a young age, he was a creative soul, both mechanically and artistically, and throughout his life he worked in many fields. However, his claims to fame would begin when his interest in image projection led him to patent the praxinoscope in 1877, which was pretty much a better version of the zoetrope. And in 1879 he made an updated version of it called the praxinoscope theater. Eventually, the praxinoscope would be given projection capabilities, which, among other things, was one of the devices used to project Edward Maybridge's famed The Horse in Motion. Reynaud's next invention was the théâtre optique, patented in 1889 and first showed at that year's World's Fair in Paris. Over the next few years, improvements were made to the device, and finally, on October 28, 1892, Reynaud unveiled to the public the théâtre optique and screened its first films, which he called Pantomimes Lumineuses, marking what some consider to be the birth of animation and even film as a whole, although it was released a few years after the very first films. Reynaud had produced 3 films for his initial screenings. The first of these was Un Bon Bac, produced in 1888, a film that is largely lost. The second, Les Clowns et ses Chiens, was produced in 1890 and is entirely lost. And third, produced in 1891, was the only one of these 3 originals that survives in its entirety to this day, Pauvre Pierrot. Pauvre Pierrot, like Reynaud's other Pantomimes Lumineuses, was made by painting images onto gelatin plates that were attached to reels of perforated cloth bands ran through a machine, and having a magic lantern's light hit a series of lenses and mirrors allowed the images to be projected in sequence when the machine was cranked. Amusingly, this means that the first animated films were made with paint on gelatin as a medium, as opposed to a method one might expect, like drawing or stop motion. The story is fairly simple, but fully appreciating it requires an understanding of an early form of European theater called commedia dell'arte, popular from the 16th through 18th centuries. In these stories were numerous stock characters, effectively folklore characters like King Arthur or Robin Hood, and 3 of them are featured in Pauvre Pierrot. Harlequin, a clever servant who often uses tricks to woo his mistress Columbine, another servant who would often have several men pining for her. One of those men was the titular Pierrot, a character whose portrayal varied, but traditionally was that of a sad clown. In Pauvre Pierrot, Harlequin sneaks into a courtyard to woo Columbine. However, he soon has to hide from Pierrot. But after Harlequin plays a series of tricks on Pierrot, the titular character runs off, and Harlequin is able to safely visit Columbine. It may seem like a rudimentary story, but keep in mind that in the early days of cinema, the majority of films were just shots of people walking or sneezing. This actually tells a story, complete with characters, rising and falling action, and a familiar 3-act structure. So relative to most other films of this period, Pauvre Pierrot actually has a fairly sophisticated story, even if there are some brief sequences that could be considered filler. What about the presentation? Obviously, the animation isn't super fluid, organic, or lifelike. It looks more like a storyboard or animatic. However, there are some neat tricks, like having Harlequin climb over the fence or hide behind the lamppost. Obviously, they're in part for show, but impressive nonetheless. This is especially impressive since the background remains static, achieved using additional projections. In most other early animated films, even the backgrounds had to be redrawn frame by frame. It wasn't until John Randolph Bray and Earl Hurd's development of cell animation in 1913 that audiences usually saw static backgrounds. So it's interesting that the very first animated films didn't suffer from this. Also of note is that because these films are just light projections of paintings, they're in full color, which predates the debut of Thomas Cat by almost 3 decades. One small problem is that the exposure actually allows you to see through the characters a little, but considering this was one of the first animated films and so the technology was new, I can give it a pass. It's not too distracting. But this film had more to offer than just visuals. Reynaud's films had original music, composed by one Gaston Paulin, and these scores were played live to accompany the visuals. The film also made use of simple synchronized sound effects, which were made possible by electromagnets on the film bands. Again, this is years before synchronized sound was commonplace or even frequently experimented with. Overall, Pauvre Pierrot was actually very ahead of its time. Not only was it one of the first 3 animated films, but it featured story and presentation elements that wouldn't become commonplace for years. Static backgrounds, color, synchronized sound, film perforations, and registration. I'm not going to talk about Reynaud's other films. I focused on this one since it's the only of the original 3 that survives in its entirety, so let's return to and finish Émile Reynaud's story. Unfortunately, the future was not bright for Reynaud. While he created several more films, made improvements to his inventions, and was successful in his time, enough so that he received ample funding and had his work viewed by hundreds of thousands, his work was eventually overshadowed by his contemporaries. This, combined with the expense of maintaining his devices and pressure from his contractee, Meilleur, resulted in Reynaud falling into a depression. This ultimately led him to destroy his equipment and throw most of his works into the River Seine, the reason that most of his films are now lost. Despite continued attempts to innovate in the field of cinema, he would never again see success, and finally, on January 9, 1918, Charles-Émile Reynaud passed away, mostly forgotten and likely viewed by himself as a failure. It's honestly a tragic story, fitting for one who made a film entitled Pauvre Pierrot. Many people throughout history have been the first to accomplish something, but later overshadowed by others, and unfortunately, Émile Reynaud was among them. Luckily, over time his work was rediscovered, and he is now recognized as one of the most important figures in animation history, and even film history as a whole. In fact, October 28th, the day Reynaud publicly premiered the Théâtre Optique and his Pantomimes Lumineuses, is now considered by some, including ASIFA, to be International Animation Day in honor of him and his important work. Just imagine if he lived to see the recognition he deserved a century ago. Fortunately for him, there are those ensuring that Charles-Émile Reynaud's work is known, understood, appreciated, and hopefully always remembered.